Are there any questions for either Sarah or Greg, please? Yes, Bob.
Thank you both for your talk. That was very helpful. I would like help in just making sure that I understand something, particularly when it comes to the pre-printed prescriptions. So the pre-printed prescriptions, you said, come from essentially the compounding pharmacy. Is that correct? Generally.
Yes.
And you said in one of the slides that there was generally no backup safety information for the percentages on those combinations. Is that correct?
On the prescription, right.
Okay.
Correct.
So in the concept of interprofessional practice, the pharmacist is now part of the team and seen as the expert. So for one of those checkoff boxes is given to, I'm going to say, a licensed independent prescriber, because that could be a nurse practitioner, a PA, it could be a physician. In some states, it could be a chiropractor, a dentist, an oral surgeon, or even a pharmacist in a rare state. How do they know who is providing safety in that loop if they check the box? Because all the risk is on that, if I'm hearing you correctly, all the risk is on the fact that that prescriber just prescribes something they'd be given to check boxes off, that nobody has actually looked at the safety of those concentrations. Am I getting this correct?
I think that's the case in many situations, but I do want to emphasize that we do see a significant number of pharmacies that do have that backup information available in the forms of studies that have been completed that indicate both the safety and efficacy of various combinations.
And is that literature then educated for the prescribers or given to the prescribers?
That we don't know.
Okay. Okay, maybe the committee wants to follow up with other questions in that regard.
Yes, thank you for the information. I was curious just to follow up on your noting the inspections that are done of the pharmacies. And are they done, first of all, after they are operational? And then how often do you reevaluate them? Is there some frequency at which they're reevaluated? And then the information you gather from doing these inspections, is there anything that then NABP does more broadly to educate pharmacies, states, other states, FDA?
The last part is yes, we do conduct trainings on an annual basis and periodically on compounding specifically for the states. And what was the first part of your question?
Yeah, I was wondering if the compounding pharmacies are inspected before they are operational or after, and then how frequently are they re-inspected?
Most states do an opening inspection prior to a pharmacy being able to operate. And then the frequency of the routine or follow-up inspections varies widely, unfortunately. The
state dictated?
And it's dictated by the resources that they have available to do that. The program that was developed to support the states, the states agreed that for sterile compounding, they should be done annually, for the non-sterile every 2 years. And that's the schedule that we follow and visit and have visited up to 3 years now since that program, 3 times since that program has enacted. We have visited numerous pharmacies.
I have 2 follow-up questions, one of Joyce, one on Deborah. Could I do 2 real quickly? Following Joyce, has the NABP ever closed a compounding pharmacy or taken legal action against them based on an inspection?
The NABP has not. We are a not-for-profit organization made up of the Board of Pharmacy as our members. I think there are some states that have taken action. I'm aware of a couple of actions that have been taken based on the inspections that we've conducted to assist the state, based on the findings, walking in and seeing something that was presenting an imminent health risk. Those involve sterile compounding, not topical pain medications.
And have there ever been any findings on topical pain medications by any of those NABP inspections?
Well, we collect the information that I showed on the slides, which are the combinations, but we haven't collected specific information on safety or efficacy, no.
Okay, and then following up on Deborah, as far as liability, is the liability with the prescriber or the compounding pharmacy or both, according to the NABP? Liability for safety, accidents, patient harm.
Yeah. Well, we don't assess that. That's typically not a part of what we are looking at. What we're looking for is very broad compliance with the requirements that are in the current 503A. I think that's shifting as states become more and more educated, and as forums such as this are being created to look at the scientific evidence on the products that are being made and how they're being used.
Can either of you speak to the adverse reaction reporting on these, whether it's a adverse reaction experienced by a patient just from an ingredient, or there's something in the manufacturing process that results in extremely high concentrations? What are the typical reporting, who reports, and then is there any information about the number of reports that have been amassed?
Sure, I'll start. So, still losing my voice. The adverse event reporting framework for 503A facilities is, it's difficult, and we think there is significant underreporting. For conventional manufacturers, producers of FDA-approved drugs, they're required to report to us a specific regulation. Pharmacies typically don't send us reports about their own products if they receive adverse events from patients or providers. Often we learn of adverse events because the patients or providers themselves voluntarily report them to us, and that might trigger us to do an inspection, for example, to look to investigate that. But that's often how we receive them. Sometimes, when we're doing an inspection for an unrelated reason, we typically ask for the complaint files, and sometimes there's a lot of complaints in there that were never submitted to us. But I certainly, when looking at numbers of adverse events or what we receive and how many, I wouldn't rely too much on any numbers, especially in the unapproved drugs or compounding space. Unfortunately, we do typically just get them through those other channels.
NABP does not typically get complaints from pharmacies on the safety.
So I want to ask sort of a series of questions, just a couple of questions that will lead us to a point that I would like responded to. First of all, the reports that you've been discussing in large part relate, or the problems that have occurred in compounding in large part relate to parenteral administration and the whole issue with the fungal infections in the spinal fluid is very worrisome. This committee is charged with looking at topicals, and so in trying to think about topicals, I wondered a couple of things. One is, as you indicated, there are other things other than the active agent, and the excipient, the things they're mixed into, can have a sizable effect on the ability of these to be absorbed. The obvious example would be mixing them with DMSO, where everything can be absorbed. And I'm wondering, Sarah, are there FDA regulations with regards to what can be in the excipients, in the agent that's used to administer?
Sure. And I just want to clarify one thing in my previous response. Outsourcing facilities under Section 503B do have specific adverse event reporting requirements. And so for those 70, they are required to report serious unexpected adverse events to us when they receive them. So just want to clarify that piece. The others typically don't. In terms of the excipients, to compound something, again, there's no pre-market approval process for us to review the excipient, the impurity levels, and the amounts to make sure that they're appropriate for the drug product being produced. The requirement in the compounding provisions of the law, sections 503 and 503B, is that the compounder obtain the excipient from, that the excipient be the subject of a United States Pharmacopoeia or National Formulary Monograph if one exists. If it doesn't exist, there's nothing, and even that's not going to help with the issue of how much excipient to put in and whether and what the impact is going to have on the drug product that you're producing. So that was my last slide that I didn't judge my time correctly, so I didn't quite get to it. But we had an incident where people were receiving intravitreal injections of, I believe it was intravitreal, it was ophthalmic, of a drug product that contained 12% paloxamer, an active ingredient. And there's no paloxamer in any FDA-approved drug product for that route of administration. And it was like, I think the levels in FDA-approved drug products are 0.1 or 0.2%. So that didn't go through any pre-market approval process. We had no opportunity to review it before it was marketed, and there were adverse events.
Oh, I understand. Let me ask Greg, in terms of the NABP, we understand that there are some companies that produce excipients that are standardly used, but what's to prevent somebody from mixing it with turpentine or mixing it with something that might, or DMSO or something else that might be potentially harmful?
Well, in that situation, I think that that should depend on the professional judgment, first of the prescriber and then of the pharmacist and their professional education judgment as to the safety of whether that's going to work.
So that leads to sort of the second piece of this, which is companies will spend years figuring out what mixture of things to put together to allow their drug to be absorbed if it's taken orally or a cream. The chemistry is very complicated and getting more complicated. Of the training that pharmacists get, how much time do they spend doing chemistry or understanding how to mix things together?
Well, I'm not the best person to ask that question. It's been many years since I went through that, but I think there are probably experts here that can answer what the current curriculum is.
And the last question, and then akin to what Deborah had talked about, which is that I can tell you from a physician's side of things, we get no training, zero, on the concept of compounding. And so we would have no basis on which to order things other than a list that's perhaps presented to us, which I think is of concern. The question where I was headed with all this, and this is for both of you, but for Sarah first, the purpose we understand of this committee is not to look at things where the intention is to create a systemic level. So testosterone cream is intended to increase testosterone in the blood. My question to both of you is, if you find different agents, different excipients, different how likely it is to be absorbed can change dramatically, in specific with clonidine and ketamine. Is there any testing or any process that's used to make sure that patients are not getting a systemic dose of something that is intended to be used locally? Sarah, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I keep going back to one of the risks with not going through an approval process is that we would review all of that on the front end. And that doesn't happen in compounding. And so in terms of, I think there's certain testing, I suppose, that could be done on the back end with USP, but Charlie, Gabe, do you have anything else? I mean, I think that's something, it's one of the risks that if you start creating formulations, you don't really know what's going to happen if it doesn't go through some sort of pre-market approval process.
And typically, we don't see testing of topical medications in the creams or ointment form for ingredients.
So just a comment and a question. When I'm hearing the consequences of the tragic fungal infections through New England compounding, it makes me want to put on the table that normally, just to remind you, there should be 0 bacteria in the spinal fluid. And that case involved deliberate injections, either epidurally or intrathecally, to treat radiculopathy. So I'd say that in terms of generalizability, that's a very different circumstance. In addition, the people who did the injections, mostly anesthesiologists, required training and specialized knowledge to even do that. So I think the circumstances of the New England compounding debacle are very different than the topical circumstances where you need no training to put something on topically, and where you would expect to actually culture bacteria from the skin in an unprepped person. So it's a very different circumstance.
I'll be fast. I just want to say, a lot of folks sort of focus on the production standards, the contamination, the adulteration issues, as they should. It's extremely important. But what we're also seeing are adverse events associated with the fact that it has not gone through an FDA approval process, not associated with contamination necessarily or a production problem, but a formulation that's harmful that hasn't been reviewed. So I just wanted to point that out.
I think this raises the question, if adverse event reporting shows systemic absorption of certain concentrations, is that then under the purview of the FDA or not if it's a compounded cream, pain cream?
So I'll clarify a couple things. So it's always under the purview of the FDA because it's a drug and we have authority to regulate drugs. Now, if it meets all of the conditions in 503 or 503B, it's still exempt from the pre-market approval process. There might be other violations that we could charge, like dangerous to health or something along those lines that are a little bit more difficult, a little bit more retroactive. But if it meets the conditions, it continues to be exempt from the FDA approval requirements.
Specifically, if you find that a cream leads to a blood level of consequence, does that give you a different set of authority over the process or the ability to do something about it?
No, and I'm not saying we have no tools, but it certainly doesn't give us a different set of authority.
I just wanted to follow up on the whole issue of the documentation that's available at some of the pharmacies to support the use of these topical ingredients and specifically the APIs, and in terms of how well that information is vetted by the inspectors to make sure it's truly relevant, and how well the compounders actually understand the content of that information or have vetted it themselves, or is it just they have a folder and therefore there's documentation, or has that documentation been evaluated appropriately to assure that the APIs are being used appropriately?
I think that varies widely depending on the pharmacy and the pharmacists that are involved in that process. Some are very familiar with it, the studies and the references that they utilize. Some keep them, as you indicated, in a folder as a reference.
I have two questions. How does USP regulate the compounded products, pharmacy? Is there any influence of USP on that?
I think the USP is simply a standard-setting organization, and they establish the standards to be followed. And
But
then it's
are
responsible.
all the products, all the ingredients, they are supposed to set the standards on that? If it is not labeled as USP, what happens? If I label my product, compounded pain medication, as USP, then it has to meet all the ingredients. But if I don't label it as USP, what happens?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, yeah, as Greg said, it's a standard-setting organization, and United States Pharmacopoeia creates drug monographs or drug substance monographs for some products, but not everything. And so under our statute, under federal law, if a drug is recognized in the USP and that deviates in terms of strength, quality, purity, et cetera, from the USP, it's a violation. But not all drugs are going to have a USP monograph. So there's sort of two separate things. One is the production quality standards, like having SOPs, doing environmental monitoring, et cetera. That's what's called Chapter 795 and 797. Separately, there's standards that they create called monographs for certain drugs. And so our statute actually incorporates USP requirements to comply with USP monographs, but it's certainly not something you can rely upon because there may not be one and it may not be contemplated for these types of uses. Sometimes they're only a monograph for the bulk drug substance. Other times they're a monograph for the drug product. So it's not something that can really be relied on to assure that something is safe. They also, FDA does reviews for safety, efficacy, and quality. USP doesn't do that, so it's not really a substitute.
So, in other words, all inactive and active ingredients in the compounded product has to meet the individual standards of USP?
No, so for the inactive ingredients, under our statute, they have to meet the standard if there is one, but there often isn't one, and there's no requirement for there to be one. For the active ingredients, it gets a little bit complicated, but there will be some monographs, and if there is, they have to meet the standards. For others, there won't be monographs. And it doesn't have to say USP on the label. If it's a drug, and it's the same drug that's recognized in the USP, it has to meet that monograph, but there isn't a monograph for everything, and there isn't a monograph that contemplates the finished drug product for everything.
But just to be very specific, if the FDA is not exerting control over a particular product, there is no requirement, none, that it meet USP criteria. In other words, you were worried about bulk drugs and so on. The point is, if I find a bulk drug that happens to be made similar to some other substance and I'm using it in a pain cream with no FDA oversight, there's no requirement that it meet any standard.
No, there continues to be a requirement. That's why I emphasize that there's only 3 exemptions in the Act for compounded drugs: FDA approval, GMP, labeling with adequate directions for use, and for outsourcing facilities, no GMP. All of the other requirements of the Act continue to be relevant to those products, including, for example, Section 501B, which says you can't deviate from the monograph. So if there's a monograph, it's a violation of a different part of our statute if the quality, differs from or falls below that which is referenced in the monograph.
Said if there's not a monograph, so that's fine. So if I'm putting in amitriptyline, it has to have been produced in a place that has met criteria for producing amitriptyline adequately, correct?
The only requirement in terms of who produces it is that it's from an FDA registered facility.
Okay.
An FDA registration doesn't mean any sort of FDA approval or inspection or review, just that they've registered with us.
And there is nothing in that sphere has to do with the excipients or the things in which it's mixed.
Right. As I mentioned, the only requirement for excipients is if there is a monograph, it has to follow it. But often there won't be. I know it's really complicated.
This is back on clinical trials. Is there any, and I'm sure there isn't, but this is more for the MDs, is there a standard for testing patients during a clinical trial of a topical to see if systemic blood levels are achieved? Or is there any standard for doing clinical trials that do that?
You're talking about as part of a drug approval process or on the back end by compounders?
Yeah, or in published papers about topical clonidine or whatever. Is it a standard to test a patient, and this may not be for you, Sarah, it may be
I'm looking at my colleagues over there.
Is there a standard to test a patient for systemic levels to see if the topical is achieving any blood level, in fact?
I can't say I'm an expert, but in just reviewing the literature, there is the maximum usability test or MUST, which is a very standard thing for topical agents. There are a number of publications, and I would imagine there's some guidance or something like a guidance for this from FDA. So this is a very well-established concept in topical drug administration. But I'm not in that world, but I know there's plenty of references on that.
Yeah, I'm Charlie Galing from FDA. For approved drugs, there's a requirement. For compounded drugs, there is not.
Sure.
So for an approved drug, if you're administering it topically, even if there's not expectation of systemic absorption, they have to do pharmacokinetic studies where they would apply the maximum amount over a certain period of time and measure for blood levels. So even a drug like
topical diclofenac,
Right.
which is an approved drug. There is some systemic absorption. It's very minimal, but it's done primarily for safety. In that case, the effect of diclofenac topically is local. That's the
So for unapproved drugs, there's no evidence for or against systemic absorption.
There's no FDA requirement for a compounded
Yeah.
drug to measure that prior. So, and I think there's been evidence presented to the committee before that it appears that ketamine and clonidine and that are readily absorbed in some of these topical preparations.
Maybe my second question was, either you can address it or Sarah can address it. Do you do any safety and efficacy for inactive or the active topical ingredients, which is compounded?
Compounded, no, and Charlie, jump if I'm saying anything wrong, but kinds of approved drugs are going to look at the formulation and make sure it does what you want it to do and that's safe and effective as a whole, including the excipients and the APIs. Compounded drugs, there's no such review.
You don't do any safety efficacy evaluations?
No, because they don't submit it to us to review, they just start making it, and we don't, there's nothing in the statute to provide for that.
Okay.
That's one of the risks of compounded drugs, that people make sort of drugs and hopefully they have some, they've done some studies in the literature, something to support it, but there's nothing that comes to us for review and it just is marketed.
Because that's our main charge of this committee, to really look into all these different ingredients which are added.
Right.
Is it safe and efficacious or what? And how to do that. And those things will be coming up later. But you had something to add? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So if a patient picks up their medications at the pharmacy, it usually comes with several sheets of warnings and instructions and other things. Greg, you had suggested, and maybe Sarah suggested as well, that there is no requirement that compounded products have any of that safety or warning material. Is it the position of the NABP that kind of material should be provided? And I wondered whether, from the FDA's perspective, if the active ingredient is an active ingredient, whether there could be a requirement that it come with, if it's absorbed, here's what might happen, kind of a literature.
I think it depends on what the ingredients are and if there are any federal requirements for notification of the patient. But each individual board of pharmacy has its own requirements for communicating with the patient, consulting with the patient on adverse effects, therapeutic values, and what they can expect. So depending on the state, some states are very progressive in requiring even compounded medications to have information. Right, and we do often see communications to the patient regarding what they can expect in the compounded product.
So just a follow-up question, Sarah. In theory, it would be possible for compounded cream to have a huge amount of fentanyl mixed in. There's no difference between opioids or any other approved compound in terms of its ability to be, any other active ingredient in terms of its ability to be compounded. Could I put as much fentanyl into the cream as I like, or is there a control mechanism for opioids or any other class of compounds? For example, chemotherapy compounds, for example,
Right.
things that might be poisonous.
I see. Yeah, I mean, in terms of controlled substances, the DEA might have, other requirements, but from our perspective, that doesn't bring it within the scope of the approval process now.
John, I just wanted to say that, I think you could compound a cream with a lethal dose of fentanyl, and it would be absorbed, because we know that patches of fentanyl have caused death in infants. So I think that would be allowed.
And I just wonder whether, as a committee, we should just get an opinion from the DEA about its view of these things.
So, two quick things. One is that the deaths from fentanyl patch manufacturing issue were also reported in adults, and that they consisted of the gel oozing out and hence covering more surface area on the skin and hence delivering more fentanyl and hence becoming lethal. So that did happen in adults. But the other concept I wanted to throw out just as a discussion item is if we go to a restaurant, we often see on the front of the restaurant an A, a B, or a C, which are the results of the prior inspection, you know, where there are mouse droppings found or where there are live mice running around at the time of the inspection and so on. I don't know but I'm wondering if there's any role towards compressing the strength of evidence and nature of evidence for the substance to be compounded. If that were in the warning sheets or non-existent warning sheets that Dr. Farrar has been talking about, whether that would help the consumer become more informed. If there were a requirement for what is the rationale, is there any evidence? Or if there is no evidence, are there at least case reports? So we understand that initially you can't assume that the nature of the evidence dictates the strength and consistency of the evidence. So early guidelines used to say it was a type 1, type 2, type 3, based on the nature. Was there a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials? Was there a single trial, et cetera? So typically the assessment of bias and strength was supplemented by a strength and consistency measure. But I wonder whether there's not some, if we can rate restaurants on A through D, maybe we can devise some scale which would explain some composite measure of evidence to at least try to rein in what sounds like a wide open area.
So, this is for Dr. Jones. You presented several different prescription of pre-printed prescriptions, and I wondered as to whether or not there are different categories associated. Myofascial pain. I'm not certain that that's are physicians choosing them based upon, or whoever the provider is, that category, or are they choosing it based upon the ingredients? One, maybe Dan and Sarah might have some way in. Two, are those categories put together in order to potentially have insurers reimburse the pharmacy or the patient? Do you have any idea in regards to that? And I have a follow-up question.
I'm not familiar with the reimbursement piece and how that works. I know that there are recent cases on pain medication, topical pain patches that have been distributed in various states, federal cases involving fraudulent billing, specifically for a federal program. I can't speak to whether what the physician's knowledge is of the ingredients, but the forms themselves take on many different categories. They'll have different categories across the top of the type of pain, and then the list of ingredients that can be selected, and then the amount to be dispensed. So the physician has some flexibility. Others are very strict as far as the indication, what the type of pain is, and then the formula that they choose. So it varies widely what the pharmacy is providing to the physician.
So the reason why I ask that question is that often when we are prescribing certain types of blocks for patients, nerve blocks for them, or certain procedures, the insurance company may not reimburse if it doesn't have a certain diagnosis. So you're not, basically what you're telling us is that you're not aware of any thinking that, of that being the underpinning of these forms.
I can't address that. I'm not certain. I know that the insurance companies and different groups look very closely and have increased scrutiny over the compounded products and what they are reimbursing for. But as far as the information that the pharmacy's pre-printing on there, I'm not sure if that's their reasoning or rationale.
Have any of the insurers contacted your organization in regards to concerns about adverse effects or why these particular medications might be used or the efficacy?
Well, no, not to my knowledge. We do work with other organizations that examine the compounding, both sterile and non-sterile, to help them take closer looks at the quality of what is being produced in the pharmacy and supplement their activities in looking at the quality of the compounding.
Such as?
Such as groups, such as I believe the name is Focus Script. We work closely with them to help them evaluate pharmacies and provide information to them on the quality of the compounding that's occurring.
And my last follow-up is, all three of you have some experience with this. Are there recommendations that you would provide to this committee, gaps or things that you'd like for us to address, or oversight issues or clinician issues that you, and I would ask all three of you. Or you two, five of you.
I'll start and my colleagues can jump in. I think something that's key with all of this, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about, well, these are non-sterile drugs, there's the contamination incidents happening with sterile drugs, being in the compounding center, many before and since then, but there are risks associated with it, with not going through the FDA approval process. And I think a lot of folks have touched on that today, where a formulation, a drug product, a particular route, I guess, topical route, amount of active ingredient, amount of inactive ingredient, all of those things impact the safety or efficacy of a drug product. And even if the production standards are perfect, if you have a drug that's not formulated in a way that's safe, you could still have problems. So that's just something I would recommend, just separating out, they're both equally important, sides of this, equally important issues, particularly in this context. I think the lack of pre-market review is going to be particularly important.
Well, there are no more questions. I would like to thank the speakers and also all the participants, and really thank you very much.